Unknowners, Realms Unknowners. If you have a collective noun for yourselves, please do email us your suggestions either on Blue Sky or at realmsunknown@thebuglepodcast.com. It's a slightly different kind of episode this week. Do let us know if you like it enough that we should add it into the mix. We are going to be doing a singular deep dive into a classic author and the companion along my journey here, the George to my Alana, the wolf to my Deanne. It's Chris Skinner. Welcome.
It's really nice to be here, Alice. Thank you for having me on. And I'm really looking forward to genuinely getting an education today. I think we are going to talk about something of which I'm a blank canvas and keen to be painted on. And you have the full palette of paints. So this could be fun.
Well, this episode is partly because I've been wanting to do like a long form deep dive since the beginning of the inception of this episode, and also because this week we weren't sure until 5 minutes ago what this episode was going to entail. It's been a bit hectic behind the curtain here at Realms Unknown HQ, but this week I want to talk to you about one of my seminal. Is that the word to use? One of my seminal authors, one of the original installers of the Alice Fraser buttons. It is Tamora Pierce, fantasy author extraordinaire, one of the earlier generators of the girl secretly disguises herself as a boy and trains to be a knight tropes. And I think one of the best to execute it in the YA genre, planted the seeds of what became Romantasy, as well as things like that branched out into more modern kind of feminist fantasy and science fiction. Have you read any Tamora Pierce?
Alice, I am a complete noob. Like
Oh.
I am green. I am here to be educated.
And you have daughters. I cannot wait. I cannot wait to force you to buy all of these books for them. Before we do that, tell me what you've been putting into your brainwaves in the science fiction and fantasy genre this week.
Alice, two things, and I think they are super mainstream things that thousands, millions of this audience are already into. So on the TV side, I know you've discussed it already on the show. I have done 4 episodes of Murderbot in the last 2 days.
How are you liking it?
I'm actually really loving it. I know that's not universal. I like Martha Wells. I like the books. I love a 25-minute TV episode that isn't just sitcom. It's funny and it's silly, and the internal monologuing that Alexander Skarsgård is doing throughout is really appealing to me. And my wife sits there next to me, and she is not enjoying this. She represents the haters, I think, in on this side. But I genuinely find myself chuckling along at this newly sentient robot who is slightly depressed and obsessed with soap operas, but yet is still a badass. And I've got no complaints about that. That is a worthwhile use of my time.
So I like it. I love Skarsgård's interpretation of the Murderbot. I think they've done very well with the inner monologue, translating that onto the screen. I do think that maybe the writer or whoever was doing the adaptation sort of takes what Murderbot says too literally. In that, I think Martha Wells is telling you what Murderbot's perspective is, but not just what Murderbot's perspective is, what Murderbot wants to believe, what Murderbot is telling itself, which is slightly different from what Martha Wells is telling you about the human characters in the piece. And so Murderbot is constantly telling itself that it is frustrated by humans, it doesn't care about humans, it doesn't want to help humans, and then it continually acts to help humans in this sort of slightly frustrated, misanthropic, grumpy way. But it's the kind of misanthropy that comes from of too much love and fear of being hurt, and self-defense, and a cynicism that rings kind of hollow, the cynicism of a true believer who's been done wrong. So I think
Yeah.
having the humans in the television show be so annoyingly stupid is not quite right. Because I think Murderbot is telling itself that they are annoyingly stupid, but they aren't always. And it's often telling itself that they're annoyingly stupid in order to like stop feeling sorry for them or in order to try and hold itself back from trying to fix their lives.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair. I guess for me, like I say, I'm 4 episodes in 2 days. I don't know if he'll have some kind of epiphany as a character, and if you are already well into this, gosh, Alex, you've really zoomed in again. That is
Yeah.
remarkable.
I didn't even do a gesture there. It just read my head as is that
No, it
right?
was it was your it was your sip of potion. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so I don't know if it will get to that point or not. So if you have already got to that point as a viewer, then and by all means shut me down. But I wonder if he will all of a sudden discover some of those. Oh, they're actually quite useful after all, kind of takes along the way. But I, I take what you're saying. For me, as someone who sits down at 9:30 after a very busy day and goes, I need something that is of my genre, that is big and dumb and fun. It's a win.
Well, I think that's one of the things that the original book manages to do very well, which is that it is without being dumb, it is easy listening, as it were. These novellas, they're very absorbable, the
Yes,
plots are very straightforward. I've just been
completely.
reading Witch King, which is another Martha Wells book. I think it was written previous to Murderbot. I should check my dates, and it has a lot of the fun things about Murderbot, which is a slightly unusual character POV, a slightly interesting sort of affiliation. The point is that our central character is a demon who has been brought into the
Mm,
body of a dying tribes girl. He is Kaisteron, and the demons can sort of jump between bodies. But basically, they did a deal with this tribal group who would trade their children who were dying or dead to bring demons from the underworld who would then sort of help out around the thing. So it's sort of this like ethical ambiguity, but actually it's quite a good and sustainable way to do demon possession. It's like this kind of
yeah.
environmentally friendly way to do demon possession without actually sacrificing children. You take children that were dying anyway, and then at the moment of their death, the demon comes back and sort of tells you what their final thoughts were, and kind of soothes the family, and then joins the family. But then they're taken over by this kind of um, colonial force, very murderous colonial external force, and that's where the action sort of begins. I think it's slightly too clever for its own good in that it's jumping backward and forward in time, and so I am a more patient reader than some. I'm probably about a third of the way into the first book, and we still don't have a lot of answers. But I'm sort of enjoying the game of it. I think it's bordering on you would have to enjoy both fantasy and crime novels or kind of mystery thriller things. Yeah, there's a touch of the Mission Impossibles about it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Look, so I have read the whole book, and I can speak with the perspective of having got through both timelines and got to the end. I loved it, and I did like the sass. I did maybe because I knew that Martha Wells also had Murderbot in her. Maybe that influenced my thinking going into it, but it is so much pacier than so much fantasy that I read. It had that pace of a lot of contemporary science fiction, and I enjoyed that. I just enjoyed the sass, and I enjoyed the tempo, and I often, when you take the risk of putting multiple timelines into a story, you kind of put so much pressure on yourself because only one of them has to be a little bit less good, and it completely ruins the storyline for me. But both worked, and I really enjoyed both, and I felt satisfied at the end of it. So, yeah, look, get to the end. We'll pick this conversation up, and if you still disagree, fair
No,
enough.
I don't disagree. I like it and I'm enjoying it. I'm not sure that every reader would like it. I think it
Okay,
does ask for a fair bit of sort of
okay,
patience and sort of suspension and willingness to go along. And I think the SAS does a good job of it. I think it's so refreshing. I mean, in science fiction, we're sort of more used to a kind of a modern tone. But because
completely.
Witch King is in the fantasy realm of the speculative fiction, often that can be very serious, very self-serious, very sort of ponderous and pompous in its attempt to seize the grandiosity of a time gone past or medieval ways of engaging with people, and it sort of forgets the thing that most, like, people have been people. People have always had a sense of humor. People have always
Mm,
dealt with tensions through humor, and particularly, in fact, where you have a very strict hierarchy, humor is going to be incredibly important for sort of playing and piercing that. Um, and so I think it is rare that fantasy does humor well, and I think the way that it's done in Witch King is a lot of fun. What else have you been getting into?
Alice, I've been reading some fantasy that is maybe a touch different to Martha Wells's work, which is I've finally jumped on the A Court of Thorns and Roses, and we've talked about Sarah J. Maas, or I think Sarah J. Maas comes up in pretty much every single or every 2 weeks on this program, and I thought I've got to have a go at this. I've got to see where it is. I'm reasonably early in, so that I'm limited to what I can talk about. But what I will say, given everything I had been told, I'm 100 pages in and no one's banged, and I was not expecting that. I mean, I get the tension that's starting to build, but I was expecting a lot more at this stage.
Well, I think that's one of the things that is surprising to people about romantasy as a genre, which is that it isn't romance. It is it is its own genre. It's a genre in which
Hmm.
the classic complex world building of fantasy is like it's a Brandon Sanderson level of kind of interlocking worlds and universes that Sarah J. Maas actually eventually builds up to. It's just that sex and partnership and mateship plays a functional role in the development of the plot, and the kinds of sex that people have with one another is important, and it's important in a sort of an epic way, which I find really fun because I think a lot of fiction can really underrate um, the affective power that sex has in our lives. The number of languages I have learned, of genres I have approached, of musical bands that I have gained an appreciation for just because I was horny for someone that I probably never
Yep.
even
Yeah.
ended up going on one date with. You know, the power of attraction to people is genuinely life-changing. There are things I can't even remember who I had a crush on that got me into, some movie that is now my favorite movie. You know, it's, like, incredible,
Hmm.
and I think it is underrated. I think in Romantasy, it's slightly overloaded, but I find it, a nice antidote, um, to the general run of, "Oh, and then he ends up with 3 wives because he's the hero."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's entirely legit behaviour. I yeah, look, I'm enjoying it much more than I thought I would, and given as is always the case in fantasy fiction, which is where something reaches a certain level of popularity, it's all of a sudden unacceptable to be passionately into it, and so I really enjoy. I mean, I was expecting something much trashier, and the first chapter, I was like, "Oh, this is actually quite good." And I've stuck with it, and I look forward to getting to the end, and maybe something more will happen than people looking moody walking around a garden. But I don't mind that because it's well written.
Well, I would say that the thing, that I think people have difficulty with in Romantasy is, again, a thing which has its mirror image in a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, which is in a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, things it's the rule of cool. Stuff happens because it's cool, and people do stuff or say stuff or get away with stuff because 'cause that'd be super cool. And in Romantasy, people wear stuff or say stuff because it's sexy. So for the rule of cool, I think there's maybe like the crown of horn, where it's just like someone purrs something mysteriously into your ear, or they're forced by the like machinations of the court to all go around topless or like feel each other up for plot purposes. So I think it's a little bit heavy-handed in some ways, but it's not more heavy-handed than ha- fighting off a bunch of people with a sword. Um, which
No, no.
actually, sword is a really bad and useless weapon, which is a thing that I have discovered because my brother Henry Fraser has gone down the YouTube rabbit hole, beginning with archery and ending with melee fighting about the ways in which swords would actually have been used in battle, and you'd be much better off with some sort of pike or flail.
Okay.
But swords are cool.
I mean, the way this world's going, noted. Keenly noted.
Yeah, there's a pike. I am going to talk to you about Tamora Pierce. She was born in 1954. She was an American author. She wrote young adult fantasy literature, and she's known for strong female protagonists and like richly detailed work. So I think the first book you've got to read, or the first point of entry, is the book that was published in 1983, which was the Song of the Lioness Quartet, the first book, um, which has it begins with a pair of twins, redhead twins with violet eyes. Yes, please. Uh, Tom and Alana. And Tom is about to be sent off to night school, and Alana is about to be sent off to become a lady. And they have an absent-minded father who doesn't really pay that much attention to them because he's sort of an academic. And they forge a letter to the night school and to the wizard school. And Tom goes off to study wizardry, and Alana goes off calling herself Alan to become a knight. Now, she's small, she's feisty, she's redheaded, she has purple eyes, but despite all that, she's quite a well-drawn character. She has issues with anger. She's really got to kind of get herself under control. She doesn't naturally take to knighting, but she is very determined. So she does all of the extra training that's required. She goes and learns from thieves and sort of sneaky people in order to have a better chance at fighting people who are bigger and badder than her. It is like quite YA, and the villains are, bad because they're bad, but it does do quite a lot with sort of complicated morality, particularly in Tom's arc, the twin brother, and the sort of the allure of power. Um, I think it's kind of a predecessor to a lot of Romantasy, actually, because she does have
Yeah.
attractions. She makes friends with the young prince. She ends up having a love affair where they're together for a while, and then they break up. She's very much in love with him, but it's not gonna work out because of, like, stuff, and so then she goes on in the plot and has another relationship with another person and eventually finds her one true love, rather than, their eyes meet when they're 16 and they are forever.
It's the first. Yeah, yeah.
And for something that was written between 1983 and 1988, or published between 1983 and 1988, I think that was really progressive and nice, that you can just have relationships and they don't work out because you have a fight over something that you can't reconcile, or because you have different values, and it's not because either of you are bad people. It's just because it's just not going to work, and you can part ways and be sad about it. But you don't have to. It's not suddenly that you realize that they're evil, or some massive blow up where one betrays the other. It's just like, oh, this isn't going to work out. um I think I will always have a
Just
soft
on that,
spot.
Alice, I
Yes.
wonder if the role of the young adult author, I wonder if they see a lot of responsibility in that, particularly in the 80s before the genre was as fully formed as it is now. The idea that they are creating fiction for a highly influenceable yet literate audience. And I wonder if the author wore the responsibility of setting an example to their audience that that kind of thing is fine, and not falling in love with your first kiss is significant. I wonder if it was a deliberate attempt to influence their audience based on 1980s society.
Well, I think so. There's this really nice scene where she gets her period for the first time and has to like sneak out at night and go down to the city and pretend she's a young man looking for trouble in the city. And in fact, she's going to find
Right.
a lady of the lower classes to help her with her period
Right.
and ideally with contraception. She's given this thing and she's like, "Oh, I wouldn't need it." That kind of embarrassment of being a teenager who's like got a crush on
Mm.
someone, but like the idea of like talking about contraception or talking about your period is so shameful and loaded up with shame for Alana, of course, because she kind of wishes she were a boy so that she could be a knight, and eventually coming to realize that she likes pretty things, that she is not a boy. She is just a girl who likes fighting and wants to be a knight. And the point at which she
Yeah.
sort of comes forward and is acknowledged as a woman knight, not just, not and obviously this is sort of, if this were a story being told now, it would have kind of a more loaded stuff about gender presentation. But here it is that classic thing of she wants to be a knight and she thinks to be a knight you have to be a boy. And that's true because it's a very, patriarchal society. And then she proves that you can be a knight and a woman, and not everyone's happy about it. Um, so that she has to take advantage of the connections that she's built and the friends that she has and the fact that she is friends with the prince to, she's not playing a fair deck of cards, and she's not been dealt a fair deck of cards. And I think that's one of the really
Mhm.
interesting things about being an outlier, or where it's like not everything she gets she's earned, but she's earned so much to get there that it's kind of, I think it's really fantastic and a lot of fun.
I'd be really interested to get your take on how much Tamora Pierce was was part of the evolution, or herself was actually a someone who brought change herself. And when you talk about certain tropes, I'm interested to know how much you credit her with kicking some of that stuff off, and how much she was a part of that lineage. So, just to put a Game of Thrones comparison out, which is also, I think, were first coming out in around the 80s as well. You've talked about people with purple eyes. You've talked about uh, girls taking on the fighting stuff. I mean, even like a subsequent character has the Brienne of Tarth role. You've got someone who, like Arya Stark role, is sort of highborn, but is mixing up that thief urchin experience with the real people and then going back up. Like, where does she sit as trendsetter and as of her time?
I think where she sits is sort of on the leading edge, but not necessarily the first, but maybe the first to do it in a way that sort of hit
Hmm.
the mainstream for certain tropes, the way that she used tropes that were comfortable in the genre, the underdog coming up in night school, with a
Yeah,
secret
yeah,
and so on and so forth, but sort of made them about female characters and not just male characters with a skin on, not just like, let's call it a female and it does all the things that a male does,
yeah,
but
yeah,
like
yeah.
actually what would it be like to be a girl who was good at fighting, who wanted to become a knight, and the ways in which that's possible, the ways in which that's impossible, the ways in which you can keep that secret, the way that you need to recruit other people to keep the secret for you. Um, and yeah, I think it's a really, I think it was deeply influential, certainly for the way that it dealt with romance. It doesn't have sex on page really, except in that slightly sort of
Yeah.
YA way. Um, but it deals with the consequences of sex and the kind of the expectations that people have about sex, um, really well and really sort of age appropriately. Or I felt that it was age appropriate for me when I was reading it as a young teen. Like it gave me a really comforting sense that there were ethics and morals and ways that sex had consequences, but that that it was a thing that was something that you ought to control and not be sort of afraid of. Uh, and I think that might have been the first time I got that message from a book, which is one
Yeah.
of the things I
Okay.
think those books really are very powerful when it comes to creating ethical frameworks for people who might be otherwise inside a very strict moral structure or not being talked to about this stuff at all. Um, I think, yeah, making it about sort of relationships is incredibly useful.
So, it'd be good for me to understand then. So you read these books as a teen. Uh, it'd be good to know, have you read them as an adult? Is this a book I'm buying for my oldest, or is this a book I'm starting from scratch as an adult? Where do you see it sitting now?
Ooh, how old is your oldest now?
Well, my oldest is 11, so maybe not quite yet.
I'm not far off. I mean, I think you could probably start the
Yeah,
first book at, yeah, maybe 12 or 13. You got to remember that now
yeah.
kids are hearing about hardcore pornography at the age of 9. So it might be too innocent for the youth of today. Um,
Uh,
but yeah, I think certainly when it comes to, I, th- I, I don't know how well it would stand up to sort of modern ideas of what's cool, but I think it's would probably stand up pretty well to modern ideas of what's ethical.
and but as an adult, have you reread these as an adult, and will an adult still get something from these as well then?
I reread them as a young adult. So I read them in my teens, and I probably reread them all out of nostalgia in my early 20s, and I am sort of slightly
Yeah,
worried to
okay.
go back to them now. Um, I think I should. I think I should. I loved them so much, and
Yeah.
I believe in my heart that they stand up, but I worry that I'll come back and just hit something that's really awkward. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'll have to reread them and bring them back to the realms unknown uh, as an adult. Maybe you should read them and see how you feel. I mean, certainly, I don't think there's anything sort of adult in the first book. You might be able to start reading the first book to your eldest and see how it sits with you.
Yeah, no, look, I'm definitely in for this, and I will try to get a link to these up in the Realms Unknown store, so people can get a link to it in the show notes. And these are, am I right? And I know people say quadrilogy, but I think the correct term is quadrology. Is that right? That's what we're served up here.
I think we call them a quartet. I think the
A
Earthsea
quartet.
Quartet
Okay.
uh, it works for me. I think. Look, I think it's difficult for me to say which is better. I think probably Protector of the Small is objectively a better series than the Lioness Quartet, but I think the Lioness Quartet will always have, again, a soft spot in my heart,
Yeah.
because it was one of the, I think, one of the first books that I read with a female protagonist at all, let alone
And
a cool fighty one.
and then so float past us then. If give us some recommendations of other comparable books or authors. If you've already read those authors, you might like this, or if we do go and read these stories, where else we might want to go after that.
Well, I'm always going to recommend, if you like a redhead heroine, to go from Tamora Pierce. Okay, if we're going in YA, I'd go from Tamora Pierce through to Isabel Carmody and Victor Kelleher tends dark. Um, I'm this is all sort of 90s basically, but um, if you're going for slightly more modern, and I'm not sure if this really even counts as fantasy so much as it counts as alternate universe, Tomorrow When the War Began by John Marsden. Uh, that's slightly more grown up. That's probably for your sort of 14, 15-year olds. Um, and it might be, I would say that is the YA version of Grimdark. Uh, would
Oh,
be your
okay.
Tomorrow When the War Begins series. It's set in Australia, and it does have some pretty intense scenes of what it would be like if Australia was invaded by an undefined other nation. Um,
Wow.
Garth Nick's Sabriel and the Aporson series is so much fun and so
Yeah.
good, and I think a really stands up today, and particularly stands up among all the anti-authority texts, that the kind of anti-establishment, fight the system texts, which are all very good and well done. But I think Sabriel provides you with this, like, what happens when young people are given adult responsibilities to maintain and improve imperfect systems, which is a much bigger ask actually, and maybe a more realistic ask than burn it all down and start again. Um, and actually talks about kind of some of the issues of responsibility and governance. So Garth Nix is very good there. If you're looking at kind of, again, aging up and going into the adult realm with this kind of vibe, I'm always going to recommend Lois McMaster Bujold. Um, and I cannot recommend, but I do sort of suggest that you swing by your Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Porn, um, or maybe
You can't resist, Alice.
no, it's like you can't not. It's no Melanie Rawn, but it is pretty intense. But if you want kind of more where YA then veered into romantasy or sexuality, then I'd say Jacqueline Carey and the Cushiel's Dart series, where the protagonist is a sex worker slash magic situation there. I feel like those are kind of the branches that you can send yourself out on, depending on whether you want a more
Yeah.
innocent YA or a more adult kind of sexed up version of this. But you have like a non sexed up, more adult version of a female protagonist would be something like The Priory of the Orange Tree, where you have an entire kind of cadre of female warriors who, in a society or in a social structure where men are seen as the nurturing, caring ones, and women are seen as the ones who are better at being ruthless. Um, so I think that's a lot of fun as well.
I don't know why that has just reminded me of the TV series Warrior Nuns, which I gave up midway through season 2, and I watched all of season 1 simply because of the uh, trailer, which just so it has a bunch of nuns just being like badass, and then it just on screen in massive print, "Fucks given?" question mark, none. And that was it. That got me 10 episodes of that show. Of like, of like, like you talk about there, like a collective of like badass women who are capable of saving the world. That's all it needed for me.
Look, I know I'm not a dad and I have no right to this, but I will often, and like too often, ask my daughter whether she wants an apple or a pear. And if she says a pear, I'll give her 2 apples. So, I'm not above any of this.
Ah, yeah. Zaltzman lives in all of us. Well, thank you for the education, Alice.
It's my
I am
pleasure.
absolutely going to. I'm absolutely going to dive into this. I've got to finish. I've got to finish Sarah J. Maas first. Then I'm going to go and do this. We are going to post, as I said, in the show notes, a link to all of these. Uh, not just Tamora Pierce, but a bunch of the recommendations that you span out of that as well. It's nice learning.
It is lovely learning. And if you would like to join in on this podcast every week before the podcast, not this week because it was chaos, but every week before the podcast, I put up on the Blue Sky and on my Patreon what the deep dive subgenre is going to be. And you can put your recommendations and see other people's recommendations. If it's a subgenre that suits you, you find like a very long reading list of things like comic books that might fit the genre, games, movies, television, and books. And obviously, all of the things that we refer to in this podcast will be in our show notes, and the books will be in our affiliate store, which is linked in the show notes. You can also support us if you love the Bugle family. That's thebuglepodcast.com. You can become a voluntary subscriber and support the whole squad. Bugle squad. Are we a gang? I don't know. Again, figure out what the collective noun for
Yeah.
the Bugle family is, and let us know at realms unknown at thebuglepodcast.com. Chris, have you got anything to plug?
I have a podcast called Mildly Informed, which comes out every week, where we literally review everything and anything. So this week it was as far reaching as Ticket Inspectors, Couriers, and the new movie, which I love, Transformers 1.
Oh, I never got the Michael Bay Transformers movies until I went to Universal
No.
Studios. And then I went on the ride.
Okay. And that changed it for you. You actually came away with respect for them.
Yeah, because I was like, oh, they're meant to be a ride. They're not meant to be a movie.
Right. Fair enough. Yes. Well, look, Transformers 1. I'm not going to go on about it now because I've already gone about it in my other podcast in the last week. It is just an incredibly brilliant film, and for me was life affirming off the back of my disappointment of the Michael Bay movies. It is so old school Transformers, but done with the money that you would use to animate Toy Story. It's I just love it. I love it, love it, love it, love it.
Well, excellent and delightful. I also have a book. It's called A Passion for Passion, and I'm doing a solo show to launch that book in Australia at the end of this month. So I will be in Sydney on the 28th, in Melbourne on the 27th of June. That's not the order that you put dates in. Melbourne 27th, Sydney the 28th, Brisbane the 29th. And then the next weekend, I'll be in Adelaide and Perth on the 4th and 5th of July. And you can go to alicefraser.com to buy tickets. I will then be doing this show, A Passion for Passion, which is the show about writing this book and all of the subsequent upsides and horrors of publishing a book in the modern world. And that'll be at the Soho Theatre from the 4th to the 9th of August, and then in Edinburgh from the 15th to the 25th of August. And then I've got my writers' retreats in Switzerland in August and September. Wow. No one's ever going to say I lived half a life, Chris.
Double. 2 lives. 2 lives, like a split story in a fantasy novel.
Yep, that's me. Training. I'm going to secretly unmask whatever thing I am. I'm an alien pretending to be a podcaster. That's all I've ever wanted to be. That brings us to the end of this week's episode. This is a Bugle podcast and Alice Fraser production. Your editor this week is Chris Skinner. Your executive producer is Chris Skinner. Your guest this week is Chris Skinner. I'll talk to you again next week.